Thank you all for joining this fourth webinar on lobbying. As Mathieu said, I'm the head of public affairs or chief lobbyist of Finance Watch. We have a small team of full-time lobbyists in Finance Watch, but effectively most of the people in our team are involved in lobbying. We take them along to meetings with people where we try to lobby. So this is pretty much an effort of the entire team. Today I'm going to touch on 3 points in this presentation. The first is a general introduction of the EU legislative process. Then I will look at some theory about lobbying, and finally I will present some eye-openers as to how lobbying works here at Finance Watch in day-to-day practice. I will start with an explanation of the legislative process in the EU. This is a graphic that we have developed for our annual report, which shows the current way that financial services legislation, laws are being made in Europe. Now, I know there are some fellow lobbyists on this webinar, so they can probably grab a sandwich now because they should all know this by heart. On your screen you see what we call here internally the tube map, the metro map, and it is explained in detail in our annual report, which we published a few weeks ago and you can find on our website. I will go through it anyway, just to make sure this is clear to everyone. And this is not the sort of map that you will find in an EU law textbook. I know there's also quite some students on this webinar, but it is rather a reflection of the reality of today's decision making in financial services. In a textbook you will find descriptions of a first, second, third reading, showing you how theoretically the democratic process with amendments in the European Parliament and the Council position, etc. works. However, there's been so many practical arrangements around the lawmaking process to try and speed up the lawmaking process, which was necessary because of the financial crisis. As you know, markets evolve very rapidly and politicians can't take 5 years to make a law to correct issues in the market. So a lot of things have changed, and we feel that this roadmap, this tube map, better reflects today's legislation making in financial services. So I will now go through the different parts of this tube map. As you can see, it has 4 sections, 4 colors. The first one is the European Commission, and then there's a pink section, European Parliament, and the light blue section is for the Council of the European Union, which we abbreviated here as European Council. And then there is a black section at the right where everything comes together again. So you have to read it from left to right. I will start with the left part of the graph. Here's a zoom, which is the European Commission. Now, as most of you will know, the European Parliament, unlike national parliaments, cannot propose legislation. So members of the European Parliament, MEPs as we call them, cannot decide one day when they wake up in the morning that they're going to make a law on hedge funds, for instance. They can, however, ask the Commission to legislate in an area, and they can make it very clear to the Commission that it is absolutely necessary that the Commission presents a legislative proposal in that area, but they cannot do it themselves. So this is an important distinction from national politics. And so it's always the European Commission that initiates European legislation. But before they actually present a legislative proposal, which is the last blue dot on the screen that you see on the right, there's a whole process inside the Commission to prepare a draft law. Usually that involves the steps that you see before, including a public consultation where the Commission has the idea that they want to legislate in a certain area or has very concrete plans to legislate in a certain area. They will ask the public, stakeholders, but basically anyone in the street who wants to respond to a consultation, a list of questions, what they think of the plans of the Commission. Before and after that process, the Commission will have its experts working on internal drafting, and these guys are obviously subject to lobbying, and we'll get to that later. This is why I insist on explaining all this. Once the proposal is sort of mature in the Commission, it will be seen by the other directorates in the Commission. Directorates are a bit like ministries at a national level. There is one that is very important to us, responsible for the internal market and services, or abbreviated as DG Markt. And so DG Markt normally takes the initiative for legislation in the field of finance, but there are of course other DGs, other ministries working on, say, consumer affairs or industrial affairs that have an opinion on the draft law from DG Markt. So they will also be consulted. And then finally, at some point when there is agreement, then the entire College of Commissioners will unanimously approve the proposal, and then the law is published, the draft law is published on the internet, and it is distributed to the Parliament and to the Council. And that sort of splits up the process, because the Parliament and the Council in parallel start to form their opinion on the draft law. And these are the two colors that you see, the pink and the light blue. And I will start with the Parliament now, which is the upper part of the graph. So here's the Parliament. The Parliament has about 20 committees in the Parliament. The most important one for us is the Econ Committee for Economic and Monetary Affairs. That committee consists of about 100 members of the European Parliament, 50 full members and 50 substitute members. About 30 of those 100 are really active on the committee, so those are the 30 politicians out of the 750 in the European Parliament that decide on financial legislation, pretty much like a finance committee in the national parliament. These guys will debate amongst themselves what they think of the Commission's proposal, and then one of them will be appointed as a so-called rapporteur, and the rapporteur is responsible for drafting the Parliament's opinion on the legislation. This person will then make a draft report, will say we like the Commission's proposal, but the following needs to be changed. And these changes are called amendments. And the amendments have to be tabled before a certain line. I'm in the middle of the graph now. Have to be tabled before a certain deadline, and then ultimately the different MEPs will agree on a compromise position and will vote on the amendments if necessary. Then there's a little block in grey, which is quite unique to financial services these days, that to have a stronger position in the negotiations with the Council and the Commission, the Parliament takes its report to plenary to have the full support from the Parliament before they enter into negotiations with the other institutions. So in parallel, the European Council is forming its opinion on the legislation. They do that in so-called Council Working Party meetings. This brings together civil servants from the 27, soon 28 member states in Brussels. They can be national experts or they can be attachés. Attachés are people that are permanently based in Brussels to negotiate legislation on behalf of their government with other countries, with other member states. And once these guys have a compromise, once they agree on where they want to take the Commission's draft proposal, they make a draft. That draft is then escalated to ambassadors and finally to finance ministers for approval. And this is the ECOFIN general approach, which then brings the process together and starts the so-called trilogues, where the Parliament and the Commission and the Council get together and try to find an agreement on a common text. And this is also a process that's heavily influenced by lobbying. Once the three institutions have found an agreement, there's also obviously the possibility that they do not find an agreement, and then we go in the normal legislative procedure, which is not the one explained here because it hardly ever happens. Normally an agreement is found in the trilogue. That agreement is then approved by the Parliament in the plenary. It is approved by the Council as a common position, and finally it's translated and published in the official journal so that it becomes a law. Now there's one more element in financial services that is very specific. Since the Lisbon Treaty, we have a system where a certain technical parts of the legislation can be delegated, technical decisions can be delegated to the European Commission, who basically fills in some of the dots. Imagine you have a political discussion about a certain topic, and somewhere you need to fill in a threshold or a percentage or whatever. Symbolically, that part of the law is then left open for the technical experts in the Commission and the European supervisory authorities to fill in later in a process that is called the Level 2 process. And this process is also heavily under lobby influence. Second section. So what is lobbying? I am going to show you the definition that I generally use, which is very close to the one that is on Wikipedia, which is consisting of three elements, namely engaging in a dialogue with policymakers in an attempt to influence them. And I stress here with policymakers because you could argue that everybody is a lobbyist in their daily life. When you are arguing with your partner or parents what to eat tonight or where to go on holiday this year, You're probably using all sorts of arguments that support the case that you would like to support, that support the holiday destination or the food that you would like to eat tonight. So everyone is a lobbyist all the time, and it's perfectly normal human behavior that we try to convince each other of our point of view. But in this context, we look purely at policymakers, so the people that make legislation. I'm just going to go through these 3 steps. So engaging in a dialogue, to me, is very broad. Lobbyists can use any means of communication, personal meetings, phone calls, written articles, websites, conferences, lots of ways to express your opinion and make sure that the people that matter in policy making, that they hear it. But in practice, you have to say that what we do most of the time is in fact face-to-face meetings with the people that matter on the laws that we work on, and I will get to that on the next slide. As I said, you can also have a conference, or you can write a letter to a newspaper, say the Financial Times, that is then read for breakfast the next morning by a very important person. So you can also engage in indirect lobbying. You can also, if you're an industry lobbyist, try to convince Finance Watch of your point of view, and then Finance Watch will go out and defend that point of view if you're very successful. The second part of the definition is with policymakers. From the earlier part of my presentation, you may have the impression that we're talking about a very large group of people, but it's not actually the case. In fact, as I said, in the Parliament, we're maybe talking about 30, 40 members of the European Parliament that are very active in financial services. In the European Commission, the people that really matter are the unit that drafts the legislative proposal, and units have about 10 to 15 staff working in the unit, and then usually it's not even the whole unit that works on a certain piece of legislation. There's the Commissioner with his cabinet. Commissioner Michel Barnier is the current Commissioner for Internal Market. Then there are the other DGs, maybe a few extra staffers, but overall not over 20 people. And in the European Council, we have 27 member states at the moment. There's probably about 15 of them that have a significant financial services industry and are therefore important on a daily basis. And there you need to talk to the people in Brussels that represent those member states, so the attachés that I discussed and the ambassadors, but also the national experts in Berlin, Paris and London that define the positions of those governments, that they prepare the negotiations for the guys in Brussels, and also travel to Brussels occasionally themselves to negotiate. So all in all, we may be talking about 100 people in total on any piece of legislation, and you can pretty easily within a few months' time make sure that you build up that network for any specific piece of legislation you want to influence. Now, of course, who are you targeting? Not even all of those 100. You may meet those 100 people and make sure that you're aware of what's going on. But actually, if you're trying to move a position, there's no point to talk to the people that are already convinced. And there's also no point talking to the people that you will never convince. So you're targeting the people in the middle, the swing votes, who can make or break a majority on your point. So finally, what is lobbying in terms of influence? I mean, how do you influence someone? It's not just a matter of taking a formal appointment, shaking hands, and then telling your story and hoping that they will have listened to you. There are other strategies around. One of the most important aspects of good lobbying, I think, is to make sure that you repeat a message, that it slowly trickles down into someone's brain. It also involves lobbying the environment. That can go quite far. I mean, as I suggested, you can put a letter in the newspaper that the politician reads every morning. You could go and meet people that are very important to them in their constituency that they will listen to. You could lobby other groups that are also lobbying on the same file. You could talk to their partner. I mean, you can find many different ways in which to sort of indirectly reach the person that you're trying to convince of your point of view. I suggest that we use media. You can use traditional media. You can use social media, social networks. For instance, when you're trying to convince a politician that it's very important to support a certain amendment, it certainly helps if you've got thousands of people on social media that then sort of tell that politician that they share your view and that it's very important to support that amendment. And as I suggested earlier, Finance Watch is being lobbied to all the time. So what makes a good lobbyist? Just to summarize, it's a person who's able to deliver the right message at the right time to the right person. And so this involves a lot of what is called monitoring, namely monitoring, finding out what is going on, what is being discussed, who are the important people, and especially when to intervene. When is the right moment to present someone with a certain argumentation that could actually tip the balance and make the outcome favorable to you. We move now to the final session of the presentation, and afterwards we'll have the Q&A. In this part of the presentation, I'm going to show you some eye-openers, some myths, some ideas that have come across in the work that I've done for a year and a half now for Finance Watch. I give these sort of presentations on a weekly basis to groups of interested people. So first, and I already sort of gave it away, the question of who to lobby. There's an eye-opener behind here that it's actually a very small world of people that we're talking about. As I said, in the Commission, there's maybe 10, 15, 20 people that really matter for any piece of legislation. And if you're a good lobbyist, then you know 2 years in advance or a year in advance that the Commission plans to legislate in your area. I imagine you're a chemical company and you hear that the Commission is going to legislate the use of chemicals in food packaging. Then you make sure that you identify who the person is who is going to draft that law, and it's not so difficult if you're working on this on a full-time basis. You know which DG it is, you know which unit it is, you find out who is the person who is actually holding the pen. You call them up and you say, look, I'm from the chemical industry, and why don't we go for a coffee together? And then with a bit of luck, that officer will think, hey, finally someone is interested in the boring work that I'm doing for a year now already. Maybe I should have a coffee with this person. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but it creates a bond because you're working on the same topic, and there's not a lot of people that do. So if you're very well ahead of the process, then you can score a lot of points and you can influence the legislation before it is presented, or you can kill it before it is presented if that is your interest. In the Parliament, again, as I said, it's a relatively small group of people. I explained earlier that in the legislative process, someone is appointed as a rapporteur. The other political families in the European Parliament, the Parliament has about 7 big families, the traditional ones. So you have the EPP group of traditionally Christian Democrat, centre-right parties. You have the Liberals, you have the Socialists and Social Democrats, you have the Greens. You have these political families that have parties more or less in most countries in Europe. Imagine that on this piece of chemical legislation, it is decided that the rapporteur will be somebody from the Liberal group. Then the other political families will appoint someone who is called a shadow rapporteur, who is responsible for negotiating the position of their group with the rapporteur. So you get 6, 7 MEPs in the Econ Committee that are really important to talk to, and that are basically ultimately will be negotiating between themselves the compromise amendments and therefore the final position of the Parliament. They've got personal staff, political assistants who help them in their daily job, and there's usually one person responsible for the file that you are lobbying on. Then the political groups, as I just explained, these families, they also have staff specifically working on financial services legislation. And then there is a staff of about 15 people working directly for the Parliament, for the Econ Committee. And you can also, of course, talk to them and try to find out what's going on. In the Council, as I explained, there are the national attachés and the national experts that in Council working party meetings prepare the position that is then approved by ambassadors and finance ministers in our case. So these are also obvious lobby targets. Now, again, to conclude, it's quite a small world. Everybody knows each other. Everybody goes to the same conferences and perhaps also to the same bars. So it is quite an in-crowd of decision makers, and it's important to be part of this in-crowd if you want to know what's going on and if you want to identify the right people to talk to at the right time. Another point is, and it was a bit alluded already in the poll, that the legislative process is more than the iteration of ideas between the Commission, the Parliament and the Council. the Commission issuing legislative proposals, and then the Parliament and the Council giving their feedback. Because the question is, as I said, where does the Commission get its ideas? I mean, it talks to the industry, perfectly normal. You're regulating banks. Well, you better talk to banks and find out, ask them to calculate what is the impact of what you're doing on banks. Industry, this is a French government building, but could be any government. Big international groups, the Bank for International Settlements in our work defines bank capital standards. The G20 is an important forum for international supervision rules. So this all influences what the Commission does. It influences the Commission agenda, and it influences the content of the actual legislation. Now, what is one of the biggest risks, as I alluded earlier, is that actually no legislation gets issued, or that it is being subject to so much lobbying that it is basically, in our view, worthless. So what do? As Finance Watch, we consistently, in consultation responses, etc., when we feel it is appropriate, we tell the Commission that they have identified a genuine problem and that they should push ahead and present the legislation to the European Parliament. Now, that is not even everything. Sorry for the change of title, that's a mistake. Once legislation is adopted in Europe, there's also a post-legislative phase. So you have regulations and directives that the European Union can produce. Regulations are directly applicable in member states, and directives need to be transposed, need to be implemented in national law. You could say, but it's a bit derogatory, that it's copy-paste. That member states nowadays do not have so much flexibility anymore to change the instructions that come from Brussels. They basically have to implement it one-to-one in the national legislation. This is what happens to directives. But as I explained, many technical issues, or sometimes not technical issues, and this is why the word technical is in quotes in the presentation, often political disagreements are dressed up as a technical point and then are left to the level 2 process of European supervisors and the Commission advising on technical interpretation. This is left to this process, where it's actually many of these issues reflect a political disagreement and political decisions. So what happens is that all these guys that are lobbying the Commission and are lobbying the Parliament and the Council are also lobbying the European supervisors and the Commission when they have to provide technical, between quotes, interpretation of the legislation. This happens, for instance, take a file like the Capital Requirements Directive, on which the negotiations were recently closed. That file has hundreds of so-called implementing measures in it, and the European Banking Authority in London will have to decide on those implementing measures, on those technical standards. And to do so, it creates a draft document. It then consults on that document. It has a hearing with stakeholders. 99% of the stakeholders that will show up at the hearing are industry representatives, financial industry representatives. So it's another opportunity to lobby, essentially, for us also, but most importantly for the financial industry. So what we do is we go there as well. And we also sometimes have to watch the implementation of legislation in national law. So just to recap this, in the middle, in this little graph in the middle, you see the legislative process, which I described. This is what people know, and where the Parliament is relatively late and the Commission is relatively early. But before that, you have the whole agenda setting game. Who decides what the Commission works on? We try to influence the Commission on that. And after the legislative process, you have the implementation, both at a national level as well as the so-called level 2 measures. And these are all things that are very important for us to follow, because otherwise we may have a victory in the legislative process that we may end up losing in the technical game afterwards. And so an important work stream for us, now that we've existed for a year and a half, is to work ahead of the legislative process, try to set the agenda rather than follow the agenda, and to follow the files that we have lobbied on in Brussels until the very last letter in the national law is written down. Now, the last eye-opener I'm presenting right now, and then we'll go to the Q&A, is a relatively, it's a new one. I've not presented this one before, so this is a sort of premiere. It's the message of David and Goliath. We often get asked the question whether we don't feel like David fighting against Goliath. And what I want to illustrate here is that there's actually not one Goliath, to be fair. There are a lot of giants out there, and the abbreviations that you see here on the screen are the names of the 14 random European trade associations in finance. So I take the one in the middle. EFCA it stands for European Venture Capital Association, so they defend venture capital funds. These guys have a different interest than the FESE, which is the Federation of European Stock Exchanges, which defends the stock exchanges, the bourses in the different countries. And to the left of EFCA, you have the ESBG, which is the savings bank group, which defends a very particular type of banks, namely savings banks. So we're not fighting one Goliath, we're not fighting the financial industry, there's not such a thing as the financial industry, but there are different players that have different interests and often lobby against each other. Here are a few more examples. Banks, for instance, have to live with certain capital rules. They must hold a lot of capital, liquidity, cash, to make sure that they can meet their obligations. And so they have an interest in trying to bring those requirements down, and we have an interest in perhaps bringing those requirements up. But then the same could apply to insurance. Insurance also deal with a lot of money, and if they suddenly would go bust, then there's a big problem with the clients of the insurance companies. But they claim they're not banks because they're differently structured and they should not be subject to the same rules. And then pension funds, for instance, they say the same. We provide products that look like insurance products. For instance, a life insurance is very comparable economically to a pension investment because it gives you money after retirement against an upfront payment of a certain sum. But of course, the pension funds say we're not exactly like insurers, so we should have different rules. So they fight on each other's legislation. Then in banks, you have small banks, you have big, very big global universal banks, you have cooperative banks, you have extremely local banks. They all have different interests. In the financial markets, so you have the exchanges, as I mentioned earlier, but you have all sorts of different technical actors that have a certain role in the process when you trade shares. For instance, if I trade a share with Mathieu here, then there is someone who takes the share from me and the money from Mathieu and then exchanges it and gives me the money and the share to Mathieu. You have market makers like high frequency traders who are in the market not trading on behalf of someone else but for themselves. They're trying to buy a share and sell it at a higher price or the other way around. Those guys are called short sellers. Then you've got the hedge funds, retail investment funds. You've got the venture capital, private equity industry that buys up companies, takes them off the stock exchange, makes them healthy again, and puts them back on the stock exchange. You have the rating agencies, which have seen an enormous amount of legislation come at them in the last few years, who are in a way not involved in the day-to-day process in these markets, but they provide a service. They give their opinion. They say, look, we think this country or this company is worth credit. And then you've got payment service providers in the field of retail, credit card companies, online payment companies. All these guys have completely different agendas and they lobby for their own agenda and often against each other. So we as Finance Watch, we not always get involved, and sometimes we just simply watch two Goliaths destroy each other without any need for us to intervene. I'll leave it here. I just want to make a final call before we go to the Q&A, and that is please join Finance Watch, become a friend of Finance Watch, follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and there's also the website where you can find the annual report, which on page 16 and 17 explains in more detail the EU legislative process. Over to you, Mathieu.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joost, for this very clear presentation. Thanks for talking just 30 minutes, because Joost has been talking, but now it's your turn. So on your computer screen, you have the possibility to send us questions. So please send us your question, and Joost will be happy to answer them. We have already received some. So let me start immediately. I think there is a very interesting one here. Donna asks, you said Finance Watch was also being lobbied. Can you explain this a bit further?
Yes, thanks for the question. As I explained, you have direct lobbying and indirect lobbying, and Finance Watch is very visible in lobbying in financial services in Brussels. So lobbyists from the financial industry, they think, well, if I can convince Finance Watch of a certain point of view, without them realizing perhaps, or I can make an alliance with Finance Watch because we share the same interests, which could be the case. Maybe, if we would not like certain things that big banks are doing, we could be friends with the small banks and advance the same arguments that the small banks advance. This is a purely fictitious example. So if they manage to convince Finance Watch, then Finance Watch will go out and defend its position, which includes a little bit of the position of that industry lobbyist. So then basically we are doing their work. And I think this is the reason why, and you can find the figures back in our annual report, we have as much meetings where we are the target of lobby than where we are the sender, the issuer of a lobbying message, if you want.
Mm-hmm. All right, that's perfect. Another question here from Nicolas. Is every contact with a legislator or a staff called lobbying?
So it's a very good question, and it makes me think of discussions about the transparency register. As some of you may know, there is a list of lobbyists on the European Commission website. Anybody who thinks they are a lobbyist can be asked to be put on that list. In exchange, you have to give some transparency about who funds you, for instance. You can find us on that register as well. And you can get free access. You can walk into freely into the European Parliament. It just saves you some time to be signed into the Parliament. Then the question, of course, when they launched that register, that came up a lot was, so what is lobbying and what should I count as lobbying? I work 40 hours a week for Finance Watch or a little bit more. Should I consider all those 40 hours lobbying? Or is talking to a journalist to understand what is going on, or talking to a parliamentary assistant to understand what's going on, is that part of lobbying, or is it only lobbying when you actually make a meeting with someone and you have 60 minutes and you try to convince them? Is shaving in the morning so that you look proper for that meeting, is that considered lobbying or not, and should you count that time? This is important for some of the lobbyists on the register, and this is why you will find very different figures on the register as to how much companies spend on lobbying, because there is not really a good definition for these points. But I would personally argue that anything that prepares or enables you to engage with policymakers is considered lobbying. We have our in-house research team here. They prepare the reports that you can find on our website, and that is what we use as a background material to lobby. You could also argue that the work that they do, the research they do, is part of lobbying.
I see there is a question coming from Jennifer, who is basically not based in Brussels. I represent the Community Investment Coalition, lobbying for financial sector reform in the UK and London-based. How easy is it to lobby without physically coming to Brussels? You think it's important, this presence, with the work that you are doing?
Yeah. I think it's very difficult to lobby without physically coming to Brussels. Physically being in Brussels is a different story. It greatly helps to be here, to be available for meetings, also with the more junior people, with the parliament assistants, with the desk officers, the attachés, etc. It doesn't always have to be a commissioner or a finance minister or an MEP. It helps a lot to understand the process, to understand who are the people pushing for certain ideas, when is the right time to act, when is something going to come up. That is a lot easier if you're physically based in Brussels, but it's not important. It's not impossible to follow a process from elsewhere. The Parliament has done great efforts, for instance, web streaming their committee meetings. They've improved their observatory of legislative procedures, so you can more or less follow on the internet what stage a discussion is in. So that is, it's possible to circumvent that. Also, Finance Watch, for its member organizations, acts as a eyes and ears in Brussels, as a hub for information. So we get a lot of questions from our member organizations asking what is going on and when should we go talk to the German ambassador about this particular piece of legislation. So someone else can do that for you. Professional consultancies, law firms can do that for you as well. But it is unavoidable that occasionally you come to Brussels, or incidentally Strasbourg, or Paris, Frankfurt and London, where the European supervisory authorities are based, if you want to lobby on the level 2 process. That is unavoidable to make those trips once in a while.
All right. Question from Benoit. I think it's an interesting question. Don't you think that in question of power balance, regulators have generally a better ear for you, Finance Watch, than the representative of the industry, which then compensate in the end? I think it's what's your perception on that?
One of the parliamentarians that called for the creation of something like Finance Watch a few years ago was the rapporteur on the Hedge Funds Directive, and he complained that over the course of 2 months he had met 200 industry representatives in his office in Brussels and no one else. No alternative voice, no counterweight, or whatever you want to call it. Now, it's obvious that if you're a good politician and you listen to 200 industry people and then you listen to Finance Watch and hopefully a few more NGOs, that you attach more weight to the few people from that don't represent the industry. But that is a political job, and normally a politician should be able to weigh the different opinions that are presented to him.
All right. Let me check. There are some questions. I'm not going to take them all, but I see Joanne or Doreen. You know, people talk about the regulation, the negative image. I mean, can you maybe express something here about what's going on in Brussels with regard to regulation, and how Finance Watch is basically taking part of this process of transparency, which has started a few years ago?
You mean lobbyists?
Yes, transparency for lobbyists, of course.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are NGOs that are specialized in corporate influence, in lobbying, and in general how corporations, how business, the financial industry, but also others, drive the European decision-making process. How close they are to governments, how close they are to the Commission, and sort of how what their influence is. We at Finance Watch sort of accept that there is interest representation, that there is lobbying, and we take that as a fact of life. And next to that, next to the completely legitimate interest representation of the financial industry, we put a different perspective, and we hope that people listen more to that perspective. So we don't focus too much on that sort of lobby transparency agenda, but of course it is very important, because if all the institutions would be extremely transparent, if Council working party meetings, trialogues, and European Parliament compromise meetings, expert groups would be completely transparent and publish their notes and publish their agendas, etc., then it would be a lot more easier for people outside of Brussels to follow and influence the legislative process. We would not be unnecessary, but a large part of the work that we do is creating transparency in the field where there's absolutely none.
An interesting question here also from Dirk. Is lobbying measurable, or do you have any statistics for lobbying networks? So here, if I understand the question, I'm not sure, it seems there may be two questions, but you know, can we say that is lobbying really effective? Is it working?
Yeah. And the second part is probably what is the size of lobbying, etc. I'll take the first. I think I interpret the question in the first way, which is how can you measure what's the value of a lobbyist, of people working in public affairs, etc. Now, of course, you could count the number of changes that you've managed to get into legislation. For instance, a number of amendments tabled in the Parliament, number of amendments adopted, but it's very difficult to prove that you were the driving force behind a certain textual change. And it also is very dangerous because it overemphasizes the role of the transparent of the public process. If I am a very good lobbyist and I make sure that whatever the Commission proposes is exactly what my boss wants, then I don't need to table any amendments in the Parliament or in the Council. I can just sit back and relax, hope that everything survives, and I'm done with my job. I will lose my job because my boss will say, you've been doing nothing and you didn't propose any amendments to MEPs and they were not adopted. So what's your added value? So it's very difficult to measure your direct impact on the legislative process, and it's also very difficult to distinguish between jumping on a train that is already running. Say there is a trend that high frequency trading or food speculation should be regulated. We repeat that message, we push for that message to be included in legislation, and then it gets included in legislation. Is that our success, or are we just part of a successful trend? This is why, for instance, in our annual report, when we assess our influence, we don't claim certain victories as ours or certain defeats, but we rather state that the points that are important to us, apparently, partly because of our influence, but also partly because of others, and most importantly, our members, who are very important NGOs in civil society, consumer groups, environment groups, anti-lobby groups, because of a combined effort of the NGO world. The second part of the question, I think, is the sort of quantification of the size of the lobby industry. There are different figures circulating. We estimate that between 500 and 1,000 people are active in financial services. The number of lobbyists in Brussels, different sources quote between 15 and 30,000, I think is the highest I've heard. In the UK, there was recent research which quantified that the banks were spending £90 million a year. The financial industry was spending £90 million a year on lobbying. We collaborated on some research that still should be coming out, which quantified the European spending in financial services a bit over 100 million euros a year. So that all seems to get together. We are talking about an industry that is tens of thousands of people in Brussels, of which a few thousand in finance.
We have more questions coming. I hope we'll be able, but Dirk is saying thank you for the answer. So that's a good feedback. Thank you for the feedback, Dirk. Here there is one. You mentioned at the start of your presentation the rule of thumb of 5 years for legislation as level 2. Ironically, increased the length of the process and encouraged extra lobbying. What do you think about it? Is the question clear? Do you understand?
Yeah, I understand.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, the fact that you have a level 2 process means that lobbying continues after the legislative phase. But you have to recognize that before the level 2 system, before the Lisbon Treaty, there was already something called the level 3 committees, the 3 European supervisory authorities. So there is a banking authority in London, securities markets authority in Paris, and the insurance and pensions authority in Frankfurt. These 3 authorities had their predecessors, and they were basically collaboration committees of the national regulators in their field, in the same cities, largely with the same people, but smaller. So already in the last decade, there has always been a will to harmonize technical details of legislation, and therefore there was already lobbying going on at that level. But it is true that because with the Lisbon Treaty, with the new system, effectively a lot more power is delegated to the European Commission and to the supervisory authorities, that it is even more important for lobbyists to be involved in that process. And you can see any hearing at EBA or ESMA, you will get between 50 and sometimes up to 80 people from the financial industry in one room speaking at a hearing. They pay enormous sums to law firms to represent them there, to study the very technical detail of legislation. So it's very important for the industry to continue its lobby until the level 2 process is complete. But I'm not sure that is entirely new. I mean, it was partly with the old supervisory authorities, and it was probably also partly at a national level, because before the Lisbon Treaty, we had much more often we had so-called minimum harmonization legislation, where member states could go a bit further, and what was called gold plating would add requirements to the national legislation. And the industry has always been lobbying against that at a national level as well.
Question here from Johannes. is there a difference between finance lobbying in Brussels and lobbying in Washington? I mean, without maybe spending too much on the question, but maybe there are some differences on the.
Yeah, there are some big differences. I mean, what for me is the most important difference is that the American lawmakers have a lot more resources to research legislation. So they are a lot less dependent on lobbyists to provide them with technical information, which by definition, and there's nothing wrong with that, is always a bit colored, is always a bit biased. You don't present your enemies' arguments, so you present figures that are good for you when people ask you for figures. I'm exaggerating perhaps a bit, but you have to filter as a policymaker. In the US, the Senate and the Congress have much bigger resources to do their own research, and therefore they're less dependent on the lobby. Strangely enough, the amount of lobbyists is much higher in the US, and the profession is also much more regulated. Lobbyists in the US have to frequently fill in on an electronic system how many minutes they have spent talking to policymakers. The US has very strict rules on hospitality, on gifts to policymakers. You cannot invite someone to a seated dinner, but you can give them finger food at a standing reception. But then in the US, you can give millions of dollars in party financing to your presidential candidate or to a political party. So it is a very different system. The US also finally has an enormous legal component in its lawmaking system. For instance, one of the files that we work on the moment, trying to limit speculation on derivative markets, on food markets most importantly, involves the use of so-called position limits. The Americans have introduced, before the Europeans have introduced, a rule to limit speculation on derivative markets, but that rule is not being lobbied against, it's being challenged in court by the financial industry. So you have that legal component that stops or freezes the implementation of legislation that is much less visible or much less present actually in Europe.
Back to Europe, basically, back to Brussels, a question from Natasha. Talking about transparency, the Council is very much a black box. How do you adapt to this lack of transparency in the last phase of your lobbying?
I assume the last phase of the lobbying means the last phase of Council decision making, but it could also be trilogues. Obviously, in the trilogues, it's less of a problem because, as the name says, you have three institutions around the table, so that's three potential sources of information. Especially the Parliament sends all the shadow rapporteurs, often the committee chair and their assistants, some secretariat staff. So you've got easily 20 participants from the Parliament that you can get information from before and after meetings. The Council internal decision making is indeed more difficult, and where we certainly do not have any counter lobbying power is there's a famous example from 2009, I think, on when the hedge funds directive was being negotiated, and it neared approval in the Council, general approach for starting the negotiations with the Parliament. And it was the Spanish presidency, and the UK Prime Minister was looking for re-election, and essentially, as the story goes, called up the Spanish the Spanish Prime Minister the evening before the ECOFIN and said, you have to take this off the agenda because this hedge fund stuff is going to hurt the city and it's going to destroy my re-election. And then the Spanish Finance Minister on Tuesday morning walked into the Finance Minister Council and to her surprise found out that the item had been taken off the agenda and was to be discussed 2 months later after the UK general election. Now, this sort of thing happens, and I mean, big governments, big lobby groups like Business Europe or something, not even in the financial world per se, but really the employers of Europe or the trade unions of Europe or whatever, they can still, in a very last phase of council negotiations, move things. That is a part where we are weak, but at any earlier stage in the council negotiating process, we know pretty well what is going on. Again, if you have a meeting with 27 member states, you have at least 27 people around the table, and all of these 27 people can tell you what happened, can leak a document. So there are enough people participating in these meetings to enable them to provide information anonymously without being traced. So we do find out what's going on. But without resources and without presence in Brussels, that is very difficult.
Well, we receive lots of questions and we won't have time to discuss them all. One by Nicolas, because you said 27 member states. soon Croatia is joining. I mean, for you as a lobbyist, does it impact your strategy? And maybe more regarding on finance, do you think there is an opportunity there or anything?
Well, I'll take back the poll that we did. What is the most influential institution? For those who follow Brussels a bit longer, they will remember the Big Bang expansion of the EU in 2004, when we went from 15 to 25 member states. And at that time, it was obvious that the Council in the years after was weaker, because it was finding it difficult to find agreement amongst 25 countries, whereas previously they were doing that with 15. Then we went to 27 with Bulgaria and Romania, now to 28 with Croatia. But the Council has improved its internal working, and it has improved its decision making. And with no offense to Croatia or to any other potential new member states, but there are three countries that really matter in financial services decision making. That's France, the UK, and Germany. So I doubt that the arrival of a few more member states is going to massively change the power balance in the Council, or our work vis-à-vis the Council.
I think I have to take the final. So Nicolas saying thanks a lot, Natasha saying thanks a lot. So far so good, but we have to take the final question. In areas of as complex as finance, how do you separate technical information from political/industry interest? For example, look at what is happening with the financial transaction tax now. That's a question by Gideon.
Yeah, I would say it's not our job. It's the job of the decision makers, of the politicians. And having been an assistant to a politician for years, I would say that the only way to really do that is to make sure you talk to as diverse as an audience as possible. You talk to as many people as possible, but you also make sure that you've got all the interest covered, because then it automatically shows what is someone's personal interest and what is a genuine technical development, technical issue that lies behind, because it is shared with the industry, and then counter-industry lobby or consumer industry lobby or consumer lobby. It very easily shows through what is someone's private position, especially when on a very big file like bank regulation or MiFID, someone suddenly comes to talk to you about Article 35D. It's very obvious that if they don't care about the big discussions, that they're only in it for some sort of mini issue that is very important to that particular business.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I see a question here by Juho. Should lobbying be regulated? I think that we talked previously about this.
Yeah, I personally think it's it's impossible to ban or to prohibit lobbying. As I said, for me, lobbying is basically expressing your opinion and hoping that somebody else buys your arguments. And if you're being paid to do that, that makes you a professional lobbyist. And I don't see how you can sort of ban one person paying for another to express his opinion. If that person, that lobbyist, is happy with doing that, which I am at Finance Watch. Of course, you need to make sure that the process is very transparent. The transparency register that we have in Europe is not the complete solution. It doesn't give information about the legislative footprint, but I wonder if that information needs to come from lobbyists, or maybe that politicians should say, I met the following people, I met the following organizations, I was influenced by the Financial Times and The Economist when I drafted this report. I think that information needs to come from the decision makers in all three institutions and not from the lobbyists.
It's 1:01 p.m. I think Joost is hungry, I can see that. I hope you enjoyed this lunch webinar. It will be available on our website soon. If you have friends or colleagues that might be interested to listen to that again. Thanks for your attendance, because many of you stayed really the whole webinar. So I can see that you were motivated. Great question, I think. So thank you very much, Joost, and have a wonderful weekend to all of you.
Yeah, thanks, Mathieu. Bye bye.